Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly dramatic story of how a global giant of industry was brought to its knees, and the surprising, incredibly resourceful ways its people fought to survive. We're talking about the history of Indian textiles. But trust me, this isn't just some boring story about cloth. It's a tale of ruthless monopolies, technological disruption, grueling survival, and literally the very beginnings of modern advertising. Take this quote from 1772, for example. You have an East India Company official, Henry Patolo, confidently declaring that Indian textiles were going to rule the world forever. And you know what? At the time, he really wasn't crazy to think so. Before machines took over the world, India's silk and fine cotton absolutely dominated international markets. But history had a rather brutal twist in store for this booming industry. The numbers on this collapse are absolutely staggering. In 1811, piece goods accounted for a massive 33% of all of India's exports. But flash forward just a few short decades to 1850, that number plummeted to a measly 3%. India basically went from being the undisputed king of global textile exports to being completely swamped by cheap, machine-made imports pouring in from Manchester, England. So, how did such a catastrophic fall happen so fast? Well, to really grasp this shift, we need to introduce a specific figure, the Gomasta. See, before the East India Company established their political power, weavers could just bargain with French, Dutch, Portuguese, and local traders to get the absolute best price for their work. But once the company gained monopoly rights, they wanted to completely eliminate that competition. So they created the Gomasta. This was a paid local enforcer who stepped in and totally replaced those traditional flexible networks of supply merchants. Here is exactly how they laid the trap. Step 1, wipe out the existing brokers. Step 2, start a system of advances. They'd issue loans to the weavers to buy raw materials. And then Step 3, once a weaver took that loan, the trap snapped shut. They were completely tied to the company, legally forbidden from selling to any other buyer, and forced to hand their finished goods over directly to the Gomasta. It's a brutal contrast, really, when you compare the pre-colonial independent artisan with the captive weaver. These new Gomastas were outsiders. They had no social links to the villages, so they acted with total arrogance, sometimes even marching in with armed sepoys to literally beat weavers for delays. Stripped of all their bargaining power and paid miserably low prices, a lot of these weavers had absolutely no choice but to lease out their small farms or just desert their ancestral villages entirely just to survive. Which brings us to part 1 of our explainer, the urban struggle and life of the factory worker. As that traditional village weaving system collapsed, you had all these desperate rural workers migrating to the cities. They were seeking a lifeline in the new mechanical factories springing up in places like Bombay and Kanpur. But getting into the factory world wasn't like submitting a resume today. A lot of job seekers spent weeks sleeping under bridges or night shelters. To even get a foot in the door, a worker's fate rested entirely in the hands of a powerful gatekeeper known as the jobber. Now, the jobber was a massive double-edged sword. Industrialists used these old, trusted workers to recruit fresh hands right from their home villages. And on one hand, the jobber was a crucial social network. I mean, he helped you settle in the city. He might spot you some cash in a crisis. But man, with that authority came serious exploitation. They quickly morphed into these power brokers, demanding money and gifts as bribes and heavily controlling the day-to-day lives of the workers they brought in. All right. Let's move on to part 2, the World War I boom and a massive shift in power. So, for decades, Indian industrial growth had been relatively slow, mostly avoiding direct competition with those cheap Manchester imports. But then, 1914 hits. The outbreak of the First World War triggered this massive, totally unexpected shift in the economy. With Manchester's mills suddenly bogged down producing for the British Army, their cheap imports into India practically vanished overnight. And Indian factories? They seized that huge vacuum in the home market. They started running multiple shifts, churning out jute bags, army uniforms, and boots. Over the war years, Indian industrial production absolutely skyrocketed. Now, you might logically think, okay, the big factories are booming in the cities, so the traditional handloom weavers out in the villages must be completely wiped out by now, right? I mean, the story of industrialization is usually machines replacing human hands. So how on earth did the small producer actually survive the machine age? The answer actually lies in this staggering number, 70 to 80%. By 1941, that was the percentage of hand looms fitted with something called a fly shuttle in regions like Madras and Bengal. It was a pretty simple, relatively inexpensive technological upgrade that didn't require a whole factory to run, but it massively increased a single worker's daily productivity. But here is the real kicker. It wasn't just some nifty tech upgrade that saved them. It was also the grueling reality of family labor. To compete with the relentless, nonstop efficiency of the mills, these invisible small-scale workshops utilized the labor of their entire household. Women, children, everybody was engaged in various stages of the production process just to keep the costs rock bottom. Their survival was incredibly hard-fought. Plus, you have to remember that different weavers faced very different odds. The makers of coarse cloth usually faced ruin during bad harvests because the rural poor simply couldn't afford to buy anything when times got tough. But specialized weavers, they found this untouchable niche. Makers of fine, complex Banarasi saris actually thrived. Why? Well, because the rich could still afford them even during famines. And honestly, those clunky factory machines just couldn't replicate their intricate hand-woven borders. And that leads us right into part 3, the advertising war, gods and nationalism. As production scaled up everywhere, a brand new battleground opened up, the minds of the consumers. And this was fought through the vibrant new medium of printed labels and calendars. The British manufacturers were highly strategic about this. They proudly stamped "Made in Manchester" on cloth bundles as this big mark of quality. But they didn't just stop at text. They cunningly placed brightly colored illustrations of Hindu gods, like Krishna, right on the labels. The goal was manipulative, sure, but kinda brilliant. Use divine association to give these foreign goods an aura of local familiarity and essentially heavenly approval. But Indian producers fought back with their own potent imagery. They used figures of emperors and nawabs, basically implying, hey, if this product is fit for royalty, it's definitely fit for you. And more importantly, as the nationalist movement really gained momentum, their advertisements started carrying loud, clear political messages. They heavily promoted the Swadeshi movement, directly urging citizens that if you truly care for your nation, you need to buy products that Indians produce. It really brings us to a fascinating conclusion. The story of Indian textiles shows us that the clothes on our backs, and even just the labels attached to them, have always been deeply political. It was never just about fabric, you know? It was about national identity, economic survival, and some seriously powerful psychological messaging. Which leaves me wondering, if a simple cloth label once carried the massive weight of colonial monopolies and national revolutions, what invisible messages are we buying into today?